Hi there, and welcome to the latest installment of the synchronous online lectures associated with Biology 101 at Ivy Tech. If this is your first time here, you have the opportunity to ask questions and type them out, and I'll look at those as we continue the presentation. Every so often I'll glance over to look for them. If you're watching this recorded, it's also a benefit to you. The topic we're covering today is plants, and in this topic we'll typically spend most of our time on chapter 24 from your book for this session, and if there is time remaining we will hit on chapter 25. So let's dive right into plants, and we'll start talking about the roles and characteristics of plants. So, the roles of plants. Photosynthesis that plants perform directly or indirectly feeds many life forms. And the oxygen produced by plants as a byproduct of photosynthesis is vital to many organisms. And so we'll do something kind of similar to what we showed you a couple weeks ago. We're just going to go over how the basics of photosynthesis, and we will start that with a plant. So, there's a plant, and it's going to undergo photosynthesis. The way this works is it uses the sun to take CO2 from the air. That CO2 goes into the plant, and out comes oxygen. All right, you've heard plants release oxygen. This is why. What they're doing is they're keeping the carbon for themselves. They're keeping that carbon inside the plant. Then what we have happening is we've also got water down here coming in through the plant roots. And by using the CO2 and water, the plant can make sugars. And what's great about, we're calling these sugars, but it's basically most any plant material. The sugars or carbohydrates have bonds stored inside. Have energy in bonds that is stored. And that's why we can then have you, as a person, eat that plant, release those bonds to get energy. Alternatively, the reason why we say indirectly is that you could feed this plant to an animal, and you could then eat that animal and get energy as well. The key here is that plants form the base for many, 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 many food chains. Or I should say photosynthetic organisms form the base of almost all food chains. So the other point that last slide was making was concerning the oxygen that is produced by plants. We know that we as humans can't breathe CO2. It's even poisonous to us. But we do breathe oxygen. And so that oxygen helps us to get energy as well. Because if you remember from the other lecture, you are making ATP from these sugar molecules. ATP is the universal energy molecule. With oxygen, you can make, depending on who you talk to, 32 to 38 ATP. If you do not have oxygen, you can only make 2. And so by producing oxygen and filling up the Earth's atmosphere with oxygen, it's made us possible. Because if you could not use oxygen to generate your ATP and you only made 2, you would have to eat 16 times as much food to get the same energy per molecule of glucose. So, basically, plants, water, CO2 in, oxygen out, sugars are produced. The sun drives these reactions. And those are the first two reasons why your book says plants are critical to life. But in addition to food and oxygen, we have a bunch of other things that plants do. For instance, plants provide us with building materials, right? We grow trees, we cut down those trees, we can build things out of wood. Trees growing follow the same process. We can get clothes, right? Cotton is a plant. We grow cotton, we then use that cotton to make ourselves clothes. We've got medicines that we can make from plants, and a whole bunch of other specific things. Soil erosion. Soil erosion, right? Plants anchored in the ground stop soil from just drifting away. Those roots help lock that soil into place so that we don't lose it all and have something like a dust bowl. The other thing plants can do that's interesting in this whole system involves global warming. Because notice here, plants are taking in CO2 and releasing O2. CO2 is one of the gases that is a major contributor to global climate change, otherwise known as global warming. By having lots of plants around, they're keeping that carbon inside themselves instead of in the atmosphere. So, the more plants we have out there, the more plants we would grow, the less CO2 we'll have in the atmosphere, and the lesser the effects of global warming. So, we all know plants are important. No matter where you are, you can probably look out your window, see a bunch of plants, and you understand the importance for your life. So, what are some characteristics of plants? Most of them are multicellular. Plants are fixed in one spot. Plants carry out photosynthesis. All plant cells have a cell wall. They have organelles, chloroplasts for that photosynthesis. And so you'll notice here that it says plants are fixed in one spot. Just give me a moment here to take a note because However, that does not mean that plants don't have a type of behavior. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, wait. Plants do not behave. Plants are stuck where they are. They don't do anything else. They're just there. They can't move. But here's the thing. Plants really do behave. If we take our roots over here on this plant that we've drawn the roots again, and let's say that this plant, wherever it's growing, there's a whole bunch of extra nutrients. Like, let's say there's a lot of nitrogen over here. What do you think that plant might do? Well, plants are living organisms that can respond to their environment. And so what this plant will actually do, if there's a lot of nitrogen in one area and not much in another, is it will direct its root growth toward that nutrient. And you'll see greater growth on one side of the plant. And so plants do behave in a unique way. They do so by growing. Plants can also respond to predators that want to eat them. Some plants, when they start to get gobbled on by, say, a little caterpillar here, they will, in fact, start to produce chemicals that make them taste bad or are toxic to that caterpillar or species that is trying to eat them. And so plants do a whole bunch of amazing things that you typically think about considering animals. They have many responses to the environment. They just do so in different ways. How do plant populations move around? Well, plant populations move around by dispersing things like seeds. It helps them to go, this individual plant won't go from one place to another, but its offspring can through seed dispersal. So, some interesting things about plants there. Let's move on to here in the presentation. So, plants have this basic cellular makeup. You can see that in your book. Plants reproduce through alternate generations, a life cycle in which successive plant generations produce either spores, or a sporophyte generation, or gametes, the gamete generation. And within a given species, these two generations can differ greatly in size and structure. And that may sound really weird to you. You may be saying, well, wait, hold on. What do you mean there's these two generations? Well, it's not unlike what you have in people. You can almost consider sperm and eggs as their own generation where the organism has just a single set of chromosomes, or is haploid in this case. So you can see we've got these two people here. At some point, they're producing these gametes, which are like a generation. The difference is that this is a short-lived generation in humans. In other species, that generation can actually be a big part of their life cycle. If you look at a fern, for instance, ferns exist as these little tiny plants that you don't see very often, but when they are these little tiny plants, they're haploid, and then they produce diploid reproductive structures in order to reproduce. And so ferns actually have two stages that look like this. And when you're reading in your book, you'll see different ways that these stages are laid out for the different groups of plants. Moving on to the types of plants. 4 basic categories of plants. Biophytes, these are mosses. Seedless vascular plants, which are just kind of a general group that's defined by the fact that they're vascular, but they don't have seeds, and those are ferns. We've got gymnosperms, which are conifers, like pine trees. And then angiosperms are everything that's not one of the other 3. Angiosperms are one of the most abundant groups of plants in the world. And so here's kind of the 3 types of plants, and they give you an example of each: a moss, fern, conifer, and flowering plants. But what's key is you want to look here at the evolutionary adaptations that these different species had as they came, as evolution went on. Remember, plants start as green algae. And let's actually see if I can zoom in on this figure here to give you a better look at it. Oops. That doesn't seem to have worked out. That is okay. Let's undo our changes. And we can just talk about it with this smaller figure here. You can find it in your book. Plants start off as green algae. Green algae are single cell. If you remember a couple weeks ago, or last week, we talked about green algae kind of being clonal. Sometimes these single cells work together. And what makes them single celled is that if you could take a chunk of a piece of green algae, even if it looks like a plant, that little piece can grow with a whole new algae plant. Sorry, it's not really a plant, but you get the idea. An algae-looking plant, plant-looking algae type thing. And so the first division we have here with the green algae is multicellularity, and that gets us to mosses. But mosses, these guys here, look at that picture. They're short, they can't grow very much. The reason is mosses are still dependent on water and water for reproduction, and they don't have a vascular system. And so what this means for mosses is that a moss cannot grow very tall. A moss is stuck near the ground because it can only get water to its extremities by sucking it up kind of like a sponge. Also, it still has a sperm and egg type thing that require water for reproduction. But then we get on to some bigger things, some ferns. Ferns can grow taller because of the evolution of a vascular system. And this vascular system enables them to transport water and nutrients from the roots to their leaves very efficiently. In fact, we can find in the fossil record versions of ferns, or versions of organisms in the group that includes ferns, that grew as tall as some of the biggest trees you can imagine today. Whole forests of them. And these guys still, if you think about it, still require water. Their reproduction, as you saw in this previous slide, here, requires these little guys that are close to the ground. And so ferns we still find in moist environments. But then what we're going to do is we're going to develop seeds. So now we're multicellular, we're on land, we've got a vascular system. The next thing we can do is encase our gametes, or reproductive structures, in a hard coating, a seed, that's going to enable them to travel farther, it's going to enable them to survive in a variety of environments, and we get the group of conifers. And then after we get seeds, we have flowers. And flowering plants are the biggest group of plant organisms. If most plants you see fall into the group of angiosperms, or flowering plants. And so these have taken off evolutionarily and have an incredible amount of diversity in species within this grouping. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about these. We've already covered some of these topics here. And so biophytes, these are mosses, close to the ground. They need to have water because they lack a vascular system. And so we find them in damp environments because their sperm get to the eggs by swimming through water. And these are some examples of biophytes. Seedless vascular plants, they have a vascular system but don't have seeds, so their sperm still must move through water, so they're still isolated in these moist environments, but they can get bigger because they have that vascular system. Seedless vascular plants include ferns, horsetails, and club mosses, which despite the name are actually a type of seedless vascular plant. We move on to gymnosperms. You know these as pine trees. There are about only 1,000 species of these, but we see them dominating whole landscapes. For instance, if you drove north of here, you'd start off in a temperate deciduous forest, which are trees that lose their leaves. That's mostly what you're going to see. And eventually, as you head toward Canada and into Canada, you'll get whole forests of pine trees. You guys know what a pine tree looks like. Gymnosperms produce seeds. Seeds are obviously reproductive structures that include a plant embryo and a supply of food and a tough protective casing. And so here's an example of the seed with the nutritional tissue. And here's something cool to consider about this nutritional tissue. The nutritional tissue is a really great advantage for a plant. Because if you think about it, before we get these seeds, we just got to have a sperm and egg, and there's not much there. Wherever they come together and start growing, they have to have everything they need. But what we can do with seeds is we can create this hard case that will help seeds resist the environment. And so one of the ways that helps is you can have a very harsh environment. And if you've ever seen a picture of flowers blooming in the desert, one reason is these flowers, the seeds, have a tough outside casing. And that tough outside casing lets them avoid dying in that environment until there's a rain, and then they all bloom. The second thing is they start off with some resources. They get to start off in an area that are with a little pack of nutrients that they already have. So they're able to get going and start growing using those extra resources. And so in gymnosperms, those seeds can give them a little bit of a head start. And so this is an example of gymnosperm reproduction. Pollen goes from male cones to female cones, and then they make seeds, which disperse, and a new pine tree can grow. Angiosperms, as we said, were flowering plants. Right now we know of 260,000 different species of plants. So remember, there were just 1,000 species of gymnosperms, but these guys have 260,000 species. And angiosperms include plants with flowers, almost all trees, a lot of food crops, cactus, shrubs, common grass, tons and tons of different things. Keep in mind that some of these seeds or flowers are reduced. What I mean by that is it still has a structure that is flower-like, but you may not be able to see it very easily. So for instance, a grass is in fact an angiosperm, but you don't necessarily see big bright flowers on it, but it still has structures that are flowers, just very, very, very reduced. And so there are some examples of angiosperms, and so for instance, they're showing you corn here. All right, angiosperm animal interactions. Angiosperm pollen grains generally transferred from one plant to another, sometimes by wind, but oftentimes by animals such as insects and birds. To induce animals to carry out pollination, angiosperm flowers produce nectar and have developed attractive colorations and fragrances. And so what you can see here in this next picture is an example of the animals interacting with plants. And here's one thing that I want you to keep in mind about this. A lot of times we express this as, oh, these insects and the flowers, they're getting along so well and everything's great for them. And a great example of why this it's not so simple as that, is this hummingbird right here. This flower puts its nectar very deep down here such that only a hummingbird with a very long beak could get to it. And so the idea is that the hummingbird with its long beak gets into the flower, gets pollen all over its face, so that when it moves on to another flower, that other flower gets that pollen from the hummingbird's face onto it, and then it's able to reproduce. Same thing with bees. Bees, a plant wants to load a bee up with pollen so that as it moves around, its pollen gets spread. But here's the thing. The hummingbirds want to get as much nectar as they can, because the more nectar they get, the more sugar they have, the higher their fitness, the better they reproduce. So there's an evolutionary pressure to have hummingbirds with, let's imagine this is a hummingbird head, with a very long beak that can get inside a very deep flower. So there's pressure to make this a little bit longer to get as much nectar as possible. But do you think it is in the best interest of the flower to give a hummingbird as much nectar as it could? No. That nectar costs that flower, that plant, energy to make. And because it costs that plant energy to make, it wants to give the hummingbird as little nectar as possible. And so this evolves to try to have just enough nectar and just enough ability for this hummingbird to get it such that it gets pollinated. And so you see this actually evolving to get a little deeper. So the hummingbird can't quite get it, this gets longer. And so each of these organisms is not necessarily trying to be nice and saying, hey, let's get along and do this. They're both trying to benefit. And it just so happens that these two factors combined make this a mutualism, in which the flower gets pollination services and the bird or insect, whatever, gets some sort of nutritional or caloric intake. Just remember, though, it's not always so happy because they're each trying to screw each other over to maximize their own fitness within this mutualism. Endosperm, this is the angiosperm seed tissue, which basically was a food for the growing embryo. Many plants, many of these endosperms supply much of the food that human beings eat, such as rice, wheat grains, corn, and so on. Originally, when plants were doing this, this was just a nutrient storage for the seeds. But it evolved into a way for seeds to be better able to disperse, because organisms wanted to eat them. And because the animals eat them, they eat this outside fleshy part, and inside are the seeds. And those seeds survived through the digestive tract of organisms. And because of that, the seeds are able to then land somewhere and germinate. And one nice thing about that is when a seed passes through a digestive tract, an animal is defecating it out. Imagine something eating a seed, it's going to be in a bunch of feces. That's like free nitrogen and other resources that that plant might need to get a good start growing. So give the animal a benefit by giving it something to eat. Your seed gets a benefit by being dispersed. So just like we had the pollination services, plants also use dispersal services. There's a famous story about dodo birds and a tree that they supposedly were helped to disperse. And basically the story goes you had dodo birds on an island with a tree that's now called the dodo tree. That basically there was a famous article that said, well, this tree, it didn't have any, there weren't any of this tree around anymore. And they looked back and they said, well, maybe this is because there's no dodo birds. And they thought that potentially that the seeds had to go through the tract of a dodo bird in order to successfully germinate afterward. And it's true, there are lots of species of plants that their seeds do not do well unless they go through a digestive tract or unless environmental conditions are just right. And it's a way of making sure that they don't start to grow without the appropriate resources there. And so what they did is they said, well, how do we know if this could be true? Because we don't have dodo birds to see if the seeds going through a digestive tract make them better able to grow, to sprout. And so what they actually did was they took turkeys and they force-fed these turkeys, these giant seeds that were about the size of golf balls, and made them eat them. And then they looked to see if the seeds were better able to germinate after they were defecated by the turkeys. And so you had a bunch of people shoving seeds down turkeys' throats. And what happened in the end was that this researcher found that the seeds tended to germinate after they'd gone through the digestive tract. However, the study had a lot of flaws in it. And so what they never tested was how seeds germinate if they don't go through the digestive tract. And so this isn't the whole story of this, and it looks like in the end what's really causing this tree to go extinct is the habitat loss. Most plants that are endangered due to a loss of habitat, meaning things like deforestation, cutting down areas where they live. And that globally tends to be the reason for most species that are having problems. So examples of things moving seeds around. Responding to external signals. Gravitropism. Okay, so gravitropism is basically plants' ability to grow in response to gravity. Because let's say this plant here produced a seed, and the seed lands on the ground somewhere. How does that seed know which direction to grow? And so the answer is the seed uses gravity. Because you can imagine, let's say this is the ground, you're a seed that lands here. What if you start to grow that way? Well, that's not going to do you very much good, because you need to get those green parts above ground to start photosynthesis. You start with a little bit of extra nutrients inside that seed. The female plant sent, the plant sent this off with those nutrients. And so what it's going to do is it's going to use that initial pack of nutrients to, instead of growing down, it detects gravity. And in detecting gravity, it starts to grow roots down and shoots and leaves up. And ideally, it has enough of a nutrient load to grow these things a little bit, and then it can start photosynthesizing. And when it can start photosynthesizing, it can start growing a lot more and sending a lot more roots down, and that's how we get a plant growing. It all starts with gravity. After that plant starts growing, though, just like we told you roots will grow toward nutrients, plants also grow toward light sources, right? If we have this plant here and our sun is over here, where does it want its leaves to be? Well, it wants it to be over here toward where we have a light source. it would not make, and let's say there's a big wall here of a building or something, it wouldn't make any sense to grow a lot more stuff toward a building or down here, let's say, where there's no light. And so plants predominantly grow toward light, or many plants do. And you may have all seen this if you ever had a potato that you left inside a cupboard for too long. Those eye spots will actually start to grow, and they'll grow toward that crack in your cabinet where they're getting towards some light. Because their goal is, we've got a resource load in this potato, let's use that energy to get ourselves to a light source. Phototropism, that's what I just mentioned before, a plant's ability to grow toward light. There's also Figmatropism. This is defined as the growth of plants in response to touch. There's two ways this works. One of the ways is through plants want to touch something. So, for instance, remember I said here, this plant doesn't want to grow toward this wall because it's going to be shaded on this half. But what if it's a plant that can attach to the wall and grow up? That's how we get things like ivy. They basically work their way up walls because now they've got all that sun. And so that happens because they're able to touch things and grow toward that touch. We also get growth of plants in response to touch that's resistant. If two plants are going next to each other and they start to touch each other, oftentimes they'll actually start to reduce their growth in that region. One, they're going to have a lot of competition for sunlight. Another one, they know they're butting up against something else, and they'll start putting their growth in other directions. In fact, there was some, well, let's actually skip that part. Phototropism, growth, walls versus competition. All right. So then, how does a plant grow toward light? Well, it undergoes differential growth. These require more growth on one side of a root or stem than another. So let's erase this guy again here. And let's say that you had a plant that wanted to grow toward the light over there from the sun. The way it's going to do that, if we envision a stem here, is it's going to grow more on the side away from where it wants to go. And the way you can envision this is if I start to add more cells here, it's going to make this side bigger. And in doing so, it's going to cause the plant to actually kind of curve in the direction opposite that growth. Because as we put more and more stuff here, that side gets bigger, and so it's going to curve over like this. And so that's how plants actually technically get those sorts of movements we described earlier accomplished. You may have seen that trees in some regions, like right about now, if you're looking at this during the fall, are losing their leaves. And the trees are entering into a state of dormancy. What's happening here is the trees are responding to the environment in such a way that they're saying, hey, I know it's going to be cold soon. And when conditions are so cold and freezing, I'm really bad at conducting photosynthesis. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut down. In order to shut down, they have to lose their leaves. Those leaves at the top of a tree take constant energy inputs to keep going. If you've got a tree here, I guess we can get rid of our other part of the story over here. If you have a tree, and it looks like this, you've got the trunk, let's say, here are roots down here, and here are our leaves up here. What's going on is the tree is taking nutrients from the ground and sending them up to the tree. The tree then uses those nutrients in photosynthesis and carbon dioxide and everything that we talked about over here to build sugars and things that the plant needs to grow, and it then sends those things that it needs to grow down to the roots. And so what happens is when winter's coming and it can't photosynthesize, it simply does not want to spend the energy to maintain those leaves. It's not going to need them. Just like you need energy to stay alive, even if you're not doing anything, the tree benefits by actually simply losing these leaves, saving the energy, even though it can't produce any, it doesn't lose that much, storing it in its roots and stems, and then the next year, when the season starts up, it uses this energy that was stored down here to regrow its leaves. You can almost think of this like trees hibernate. What the trees are doing is they are avoiding a time when resources are scarce. It's the exact same reason why animals hibernate. A bear does not hibernate simply because it gets cold. A bear hibernates because during the winter there aren't many resources. And so rather than trying to spend energy and losing energy all the time, or in other words, let's say you were spending 10 units of energy to go out looking for food, but you could only ever find 5, every time you went out looking for food, you'd lose energy. And so rather than spending that 10 units of energy looking and losing, it just shuts its body down and spends maybe 1 or 2 units of energy over the winter so that it can wait it out. Bats, the same thing. Insect-eating bats hibernate all winter. Do you ever see insects out during the winter? No. So they try to build up fat reserves and things just like a bear, so during the winter they can hibernate. Then when spring comes, those insect populations go back up. They're out there foraging again. Trees are doing the same thing. Something interesting with this is that in order to kill a tree, you don't actually have to cut down the whole thing.
On the trunk, and so what you would have at the bottom of this, you'd have all your roots way down here, and all your leaves someplace way up here near the top, obviously. But what we're looking at is just the trunk. And if you recall, you have xylem bringing the water and nutrients up the tree through the center. And you have the phloem bringing those products of photosynthesis down these edges here. And so if you look at what somebody's done with this tree is they've cut off the bark and just that one phloem layer beneath that. What this means is that while the tree can bring those nutrients up to the top and the water up to the top, the products of photosynthesis can't get down to the roots. And so what's going to happen is eventually those roots will start to die off, and then they won't be able to bring the things necessary for photosynthesis to the leaves, and this whole tree will eventually die.
Eventually dies. And so that's one way to kill a tree without cutting it down. So they're responding to these seasons, but how do they do this? They do this using something called photoperiodism. Sorry. Yeah, I said that right. This is basically an ability of the plant to respond to changes in the environment based on day length. And you might say, well, the key thing that I notice about the seasons changing is that it starts to get colder when winter's coming. And you might think, well, why can't the plant just use the cold temperatures as an indication of saying, hey, time to lose my leaves? Or in the spring, use the day length saying, hey, time to start growing because it's getting warmer. Well, the reason is because temperatures can vary from year to year, right? What if you had a very cold year or a cold snap early on in the fall and a tree got rid of all its leaves early? Well, it would have lost the ability, it would have lost out on all that extra energy that it could have saved and things like that. But because day lengths are dependent on the astronomical interactions of the Earth and the Sun, they're consistent every year. Every year when winter starts coming, the days start getting shorter and shorter. Every year as we move out of winter into spring and into summer, the days get longer, then they get shorter again. We follow that pattern. That pattern is reliable. It does not change over short periods of time. We're talking like, millions of years this takes to change, right? Because there's such big processes if it was to change. And so it's consistent, it's reliable, and then the plants can use it to make sure they reproduce at the right time every year. And we just talked about responding to the seasons. Okay. We have covered a bunch from chapter 24, and we actually brought up a lot of topics that you'll see a little bit more about in chapter 25. Hopefully we put plants in a context that you can appreciate and relate a little bit more to your daily life. And then what we will do next week is we will talk about animals. And talking about animals is pretty awesome because you're a specific kind of animal known as a Homo sapien, like we learned about before. So unless I see any questions over here, we'll go ahead and call this the end of this week's lecture, and I will hopefully see you next week.